I work for this awesome company called Jumpstart Lab. We do Ruby and Rails training classes, the best ones on the planet. I'm pretty sure that I'm the only person with commit access to Rails that does training. So if you need your team to level up, you should call us. If you don't know, my boss and founder of Jumpstart Lab is Jeff Kazmer, and he is a super stand-up dude. If you don't know him, he's amazing. Last year, my father was suddenly diagnosed with cancer, and Jeff is such a stand-up guy that he literally paid me 2 months of salary without working to sit in the hospital and like be with my dad. So that's how amazing Jeff is as a guy. So I came up with this idea earlier. I want you all to harass him on Twitter. At J3, we do training classes with Jumpstart, but it's always been in person, and we're starting to do some online classes. So we'll be doing Introduction to JavaScript with Nick Gothier. So if you have something that you would like to see as an online class from me or Katrina or Jeff, Katrina Owen works for us now as well, please harass Jeff on Twitter. Hey, awesome. Please harass Jeff on Twitter with what you would like to see as an online class. We're sort of figuring out what we want to offer, and that will be helpful. So. Anyway, that's my one of the reasons why I'm here pitch. So now, for the actual dealio, we can get started with me actually talking about stuff. Sweet. All right. So this is a talk called Object-Oriented Programming and the History of Philosophy. This is me, at Steve Klabnik. I wanted to give this talk at a couple different places, and when I did, I decided that I wanted to, because this is sort of an academic topic, I thought it would be fun to recreate the experience I had in college. So I have hand-drawn some terrible notes that you will not be able to read, and I'll be putting them on the screen in front of you today. So I thought this is really fun and creative and a little different than the normal slide deck presentation. So I will have some slides. You probably can't read them. That's probably okay because I will be speaking more than talking. I have some handwritten notes. I left my Moleskine at home, so I had to rewrite them on this hotel notepad instead. But normally I would be speaking directly from a Moleskine. I apologize for not being in the full professor mode. This story about philosophy and why it matters to you as a software developer starts with my childhood. So when I was a kid, I started programming when I was 7, and that's because my uncle was a programmer, and he needed to explain to his parents what he did as a job. So he brought home a computer and said, "This is what I do." And I happened to be at my grandma's house at the time, and I was like, "What's this?" And he said, "It's a computer. Here, check this out." And he loaded up Colossal Cave Adventure. Has anyone played Colossal Cave Adventure? Yeah, a couple people. Awesome. Basically, it's a text adventure game by which you explored a cave by typing in "go north." It would say, "Cave is really super scary, and there's a pirate." And then you'd say, like, "Stab the pirate with my sword." And then it would be like, "You missed, and the pirate stabs you back, and now you're dead. Try again." This was super enthralling to me as a child, and it's basically why I work on Rails today. What's interesting, though, about Colossal Cave Adventure is that when I started actually programming, I, of course, wanted to recreate Colossal Cave Adventure. So I started drawing maps like this. So this is like a 6-room map where there's a key in room 4 on the bottom left. See what I mean? You can't read my handwriting whatsoever. The lines are the rooms. You can walk between rooms. So if you're in room 1, you can type "go east," and you'd be in room 2, etc. So when I went to actually figure out how to code this, essentially my uncle did not mentor me at all as a programmer. He basically said, "Cool, here's a computer, here's a compiler, here's the list of basic instructions and what they do. Have fun," and went off and did other things for various reasons. So I sort of had to figure out everything about programming other than reading the manual about what print does. So what I ended up figuring out was that you could map rooms to lines of code. So in BASIC, if you remember, you needed to write down line 100, line 101, line 102, and you had to actually write down the line number for every single line of code, and they would operate sequentially. So what I figured out was if I left enough space between the numbers, they didn't have to be contiguous. So I decided that you could map blocks, lines 100 to line 200 would be room 1. Line 200 to line 300 would be room 2. And that would actually let me be able to have enough room to implement each room. I could move them around, and the numbers sort of corresponded with where they started, so I thought I was super freaking clever. And since I was 7 or 8 or 9 at the time, I probably was the smartest thing I'd ever done to that point in my life. But the point of this story is to illustrate the fact that my understanding of how the world worked directly mapped into the way that I created my source code. Now, linguistic relativity, which some people incorrectly call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, they never work together and they never put together a hypothesis, so that's sort of wrong. The concept is linguistic relativity, and basically it implies that the language that you use ends up being influencing the ideas that you have. Now, there's been a lot of evidence that have demonstrated that the strong version of that is incorrect, but that a weak version is true. So it influences what you say, but it doesn't determine what you say. But so basically, what I'm arguing is that my view of the world and the way that it worked was mapping directly to my source code. And so in this talk, I don't want to try to produce very many solutions for you. I'd like to raise interesting questions. So if I say something that's an assertion, you should take that with an "in my opinion" or "I'm suggesting." I have a tendency to make very strong statements. I don't mean to in this talk. But so if our understanding of the world influences how we code, then how do we understand the world as programmers? And that's really where philosophy comes in my opinion, and metaphysics, etc. So this is a terrible example, but I'm leaving it up because my handwriting is terrible. I want to show you how bad I am at handwriting. When I took the ACTs, or not the ACTs, the GREs, there was you had to fill in, you had to write a paragraph in cursive saying I do solemnly swear that I'm not cheating on this test, and I'm a good person, and whatever. And I actually panicked because I forgot how to write in cursive. I was and it's you must write in cursive with all caps and underlines and stuff. So I was freaking out. Am I gonna fail this and not go to grad school because I can't write in cursive? This is ridiculous. So we'll not use the chair example. I'm actually going to use this example, which we'll talk about Git later. But instead, that first little object on the far right-hand side, it is a shape. What shape is it? Does anyone want to just yell out what shape that is? It's a circle, right? So it's not actually a circle. Here's the thing. The line doesn't connect to the top of the line, and it's really lopsided because I have terrible handwriting, right? But you all can identify that it's a circle because you know that this idea of a circle where all of the points in the shape are equidistant from the center is this concept of a circle. No one has ever drawn a perfect circle, right? Even if I had a perfect circle in my computer, when the projector spits it onto the screen has pixels, right? So it would never be a perfect circle. It would be a pretty reasonable approximation of a circle, but it wouldn't be a circle directly. So Plato, way back in the day, first theorized this as a way of understanding the world. So there's this concept called a form, which is the abstract definition of a circle, and then there were the actual entities that existed that embraced that form. So this would be a particular instance of a thing that is not a perfect circle, but it represents a circle, and so we understand the mathematical idea of a circle, even though the real world is not perfect. And so his idea about things were that they had this essence of a true form. So there was this attribute of circleness that this circle had that represented the abstract idea of a form. The reason why I use this example, even though it's a little more abstract, so this is a chair, right, that inherits from active record base because our chairs are stored in database tables. And it has an outer accessor seat because we have a seat column, right? So a class, when we make a class in Ruby code, we are creating a Platonic form. We're saying that my idea of a user or a page or a chair is defined by this thing. And then we manufacture instances, which are the actual entities that inherit that form. So when I say c equals chair.new, I get something that represents that abstract idea, but does not totally represent it. Now you might be saying Steve, this is total bullshit, and I actually think that's true. So I actually don't agree with Plato's theory of forms, but it's sort of the theoretical basis for how we do object-oriented programming. We have these entities that perfectly represent this theoretical form, and the theoretical form does not map to real life, right? So for example, and we'll get to this a little bit later, I'm a skeptic about DCI, but it tries to get around this idea of perfect forms by modifying the form in different contexts. So, things are more complicated than the idea that they represent this idea of perfection, yet this is what we do as programmers every day. So in the back of my head, one of the questions I've been thinking about, and I have no answer to this whatsoever, is this the reason that bugs happen? Because we are trying to model an imperfect world with a perfect categorization system, and that's just not going to work out, right? In theory and practice are identical, but in practice they're different, right? Is a thing that I think is very true. So, what do we do about this? How can we program in a different way? There's this this other example that I'm going to skip for now because I want to talk about some other things instead. Git. So what's interesting about Git is that it has a notion of history and identity that's totally separate. And this is actually also Git's concept of identity and what makes a thing is actually also based on another person's metaphysics, even though Linus would never tell you that, of course. In my opinion, it perfectly represents the metaphysics of this guy named Gilles Deleuze, whose name I will totally mispronounce because it's French and French is hard. But if you follow my Twitter, you'll see me tweet incessantly about this dude, so indulge me for a moment while I talk about Deleuze's conception of identity versus Plato's. So Plato's is that things are defined by a form, and an entity has an attribute that represents that form, and that's what's perfect, right? We've already established that's awkward. So Deleuze's idea of identity is that it's based in a process. So like I am an American because I was born in America, and that's part of a process of people over history being born in America. I should say the States. I've been trying to, I promised my South American friends I would start saying the US instead of America because they are also Americans. So sorry. In the States, there's tons of people being born over history, and therefore I'm from the US not because I possess some sort of perfect attribute of US-ness, but because I'm part of a historical process in which I am born in the US. So that's what Git does, right? You have your project and its source code, and it exists at the first point, which is that circle that I told you earlier, which is not actually a circle. Then what we do is we repeat the source code over again in the future. There's like a time aspect to this, but with a little bit of difference, right? So the difference between the first circle and the second circle is there's a diff involved, right? So instead of this notion of like essences and you representing your perfect attributes, there's instead a history over time, and you have differences between yourself in the future, right? So if you imagine like snapshots of time, right? Right now, I'm standing up here as a speaker, and so for the moment, I am a speaker. But when after this talk is over, I will go sit down and I will become an attendee again, right? So if we were representing me right now in a Rails app, what would you do? Like, am I an STI class of user, which has a attribute which gets changed during a period of time? It's really messy, right? So Git's notion of identity is much more conceptually simple to something that I imagine is true, and I think that DCI is as well. Although, like I said, I'm skeptical of DCI, so I don't want to super fully embrace it. But so we have this idea of like merging over time, and Git has this whole history and temporal aspect, which is totally missing in the ahistorical idea of what things are. So
people don't know what DCI is.
Sorry. Over the last year or so, people have been talking about this new design pattern called data context interaction. Thank you. I want to say integration, but it was interaction. It's basically a design pattern from the guy who invented MVC, Model View Controller. And the idea is that in different contexts, your objects, you take an object and a context and then modify the object based on that context. So, for example, if I'm a user and I log in as an admin, in Ruby world, the user class gets extended with an admin module that gives me admin powers. And then when I log away, the object is destroyed and it no longer has those powers. So it's about like temporarily enhancing an object with some abilities. You can read, there's been tons of blog posts in the Ruby world about DCI over the last year. Yes, thank you. Sorry I did not mention that. I assumed people knew what DCI was. So that is an idea of one way in which we can think about identity differently, and how I think that we may need some sort of different model of OOP that will more accurately represent the real world. What's funny, so what's funny about this, one last thing I want to say is that I've been doing a lot of work with Why the Lucky Stiffs work over the last couple of years, and I heard someone once say that like we know Ruby can move on whenever no one mentions Why the Lucky Stiff or Zed Shaw at a Ruby conference, so I apologize for perpetuating that. I mentioned Zed about 15 minutes ago in a private conversation, so oops. Why, actually, one of the smaller projects a lot of people don't know that he did before he disappeared was this project called Potion. And in Potion, objects have essentially two slots. The first slot is for data, and the second one is for behavior. And you can swap in the behavior slot at any time, which gives you this idea of like difference, where objects can change their behavior more fluidly, and it's not based on OOP the way that like we think about OOP. So I think that Y may have accidentally discovered what I'm talking about years ago, which is something I'm finding to be increasingly true as I progress in Ruby world, that even though he is gone, he still has so much to say that we don't even uncover yet. So this is the first half of this talk. I want to change gears slightly and continue talking about why more without slides. But there's this mailing list that I built, if any of this stuff is interesting to you whatsoever, called Philosophy in a Time of Software, where we are discussing at any level, if you're even vaguely interested in philosophy but have never done philosophical work before, we're talking about how philosophy impacts software development. So we have a couple hundred people on there. It's a relatively low-paced mailing list, but we started to get some postings recently, and so I'd be really excited if people are interested in talking about this topic. I think that programmers are too much paying attention to their own discipline and not other disciplines. And I think that we can learn a lot from other kinds of things, right? So we've been trying really hard to learn from engineering, right? Software engineering is about like replicating the engineering world's processes in programming. We've stolen some stuff recently from manufacturing, right? So like lean example and Kanban are totally taken from the manufacturing world. So I think we need to do more of this from other disciplines in general. And so this is the one I happen to be interested in. If you're not, that's totally cool. So I'm going to leave up this title slide for the rest of my talk while I talk about part 2, which is titled Nietzsche Loves Nokogiri. I am unfortunately going to be uncovering 2 more wounds that we've had a couple years ago in the Ruby community that we have not talked about in a while, and that is Apricot versus Nokogiri and RVM versus RBM, which is a little bit newer. So first we'll talk about Nokogiri. So for those of you who were not around Ruby years and years ago, Why the Lucky Stiff was a Rubyist who contributed a lot to the Ruby world. One of the things that he did was write an XML parser and HTML parser called Apricot. It's like apricot, but with an H. So it was basically the de facto way to parse HTML in Ruby, so lots and lots of people used it. But due to the way that Y developed it, there were lots of bugs. And some of those bugs were not easily fixable. And there were performance problems. And some of those performance problems are not very fixable. And so Aaron Patterson and some other people released another gem called Nokogiri and said, hey, we wrote a new XML parsing library. Please use it. It's called Nokogiri. And there was this battle on Ruby Inside about benchmarks and moving stuff forward. And eventually now Y left, and Apricot is no more, and Nokogiri is like super amazingly badass and is the way that we all use XML parsing today. At the time, this is a very controversial and argumentative statement. Since I now maintain one of Y's other projects, Shoes, I recently replaced Apricot with Nokogiri. And a lot of people saw that as blasphemy. And I would like to posit that Y the Lucky Stiff would actually think that I have done the right thing, not the wrong thing, and that Friedrich Nietzsche actually supports his assertion as well. So that's the first conflict. Later we'll talk about the RVM versus RVM thing. So I want to talk about the way that Nietzsche views the world. So Nietzsche views the world as that we're all a combination of forces. So there is active versus reactive force, and dominating versus the other one, which is not dominating. We'll say dominated force. I believe that's the right term. My handwriting is terrible. My written notes are bad. So basically, dominating versus dominated is about quantity. So one of the hard things about Nietzsche is that he used a lot of words that mean something to us now that he was not using in that sense. So he did not necessarily mean dominating as in like dominating. He just meant that there's a lot of it. And dominated is there being a small volume of it. And then active versus reactive is about doing things versus being passive. So everything that we choose to do in life and everything that we are is a combination of these 4 things in one of the 4 combinations. It is either active and dominating, it is active and dominated, it is passive and dominating, or passive and not dominated, right? And his concept of will to power was the idea that we should embrace an active dominating force as much as possible. So some people, including his sister, who was a Nazi, have decided that this means that we should all be assholes and hate each other all the time, and that this like Hobbesian state of nature where like the strong survive is true. But that's not actually the case. Nietzsche viewed the will of power as being creative and giving. When I'm up here giving this talk, I am producing an active force. I'm projecting myself onto you. And that's not a matter of me dominating you. That's a matter of me sharing creativity with you. When I submit a patch on GitHub to an open source project, that's an example of an active dominating force. That's an example of the will of power. And that was the idea that Nietzsche thought that we should embrace as much as possible. And by the contrast, we should try to avoid being passive and dominated. So, or even worse, passive and dominating. So the idea of being passive and dominating is embodied by posting really negative things on Twitter, which is something I do a lot. Okay, my slide is gone, whatever, it doesn't matter. So obviously I'm not perfect at this myself, so I don't suggest that you should necessarily be either. But the idea is that we should try to get away from the idea of knocking each other down and being aggressive in a manner that's intended to limit other people. And we should instead be embracing the ability to expand other people's ability to do stuff. So this is what I see as being his lesson for programmers, and what we should be doing as much as possible is building things and sharing creativity. And we should be not trying to tear each other down with negativity. So that's sort of like the lesson that I take from Nietzsche about the situation with Nokogiri. And if you examine the way that Y the Lucky Stiff handled the battle in the heat of the moment, I've been reading a lot of mailing list archives recently. He actually, both Aaron and Y were an absolutely fantastic example of active dominating force. So Aaron did not say, Apricot sucks, you should use Nokogiri. He said, I'm building this library and I would like to share it with you. Now, the reason that it came about was because of a criticism of Apricot, but he did not in any way try to tear down or denigrate Y or the Apricot project. And Apricot did not come back and say, oh, Nokogiri is terrible, you should use Apricot instead. Instead, Y made it faster than Nokogiri and then posted benchmarks and said, I've improved Apricot, it now has speed increases, so you should download the new version and use it. And they sort of went through this battle where they both were generally very nice to each other, and also were building cool stuff, and that sort of, the two of them embracing this active dominating force was what enabled us to have this awesome, now Nokogiri library that we use today, is due to this sort of like friendly rivalry. There's actually, it's really funny, there's a particular email on the Ruby Talk mailing list from Y the Lucky Stiff about the situation, and he said, the only reason I'm keeping on developing Apricot is to make you a better person. Not to make Nokogiri better, but like to make Aaron better. And so he wasn't even saying that like, I think you're bad. He's saying like, I'm trying to enrich you by providing you with this target to keep working against. I would love us to continue improving our projects in parallel. This is like, we should be, friendlily fighting with each other rather than being super nasty about it and trying to tear each other down. And so that's what I think is one of the like greatest situations. That's sort of like an OG Ruby drama. That would have been like all over Ruby dramas that had existed back in the day. With like, whoa, Aaron and Y hate each other, and especially with how amazing Aaron is and how nice of a guy he is, and Y the Lucky Stiff as well. I am concerned that like our current culture of this like tearing stuff down all the time would have encouraged one or two of them to be nasty instead of the old days of Ruby where everyone was nice to each other, right? Minuswan. Like Minuswan is the embodiment of this like active dominating force. Like, be nice to each other, help each other out, improve things, build cool stuff. Don't be a jerk. Minuswan is Mats is nice and so we are nice. It's one of the founding principles of Ruby. Basically, if you've ever met Mats, he is a super nice guy, almost to a fault. Like I've watched people at a conference like go up to Mats and be like, "This part of Ruby is stupid." And he's like, "Thank you for your opinion." So Mats is great. So we should try to be more like Mats. And this has sort of been a trend that other people have talked about, and I'm definitely super guilty of this as well. So I'm not trying to tell you that like I am the nicest, most friendly, not tearing down people guy in the world, because that is not true. But I'm always trying to embrace my building and creative side and not my negative tear each other down side. Now, for the last 5 minutes, let's talk about the opposite of that in Ruby world, and what I think is like the foundational Ruby drama in the sense of negativity, which is RBN versus RVM. So I now use CHRuby for the record, which is amazing. If you haven't used it, you should try it out. So I'm removed from both of these things at this point in time. But whenever RBN was released, if you all remember back in time, these are both tools to switch between Rubies. So RVM was the original like Ruby version manager. You could install multiple Rubies and switch between them. And then due to some flaws in RVM, Sam Stevenson, originally it was Wayne Zegwin who wrote RVM. Sam Stevenson came along and built RVN because of perceived flaws in RVM, which he didn't want, which is totally cool. Builds RVM, awesome. But unlike the rivalry between Apricot and Nokogiri, the one from RBN versus RVM from the outset was one based on resentment, which is another term from Nietzsche you can learn about later. But basically, the initial RBM README essentially said, RVM is shit, and you shouldn't use it, and you should use RBM instead. Now, the problem with that is, again, this idea of like tearing down the other project. So RVM definitely has tons of flaws, and it had tons of flaws at the time. But there's no reason for essentially launching your project by tearing down someone else's project. We can do that in a way that's much more constructive and helps things out, right? So, for example, I did not say that both of those tools are bad, you should use ChillRuby. I said, I love TrueRuby, and you should check it out. And that's a way to, I don't think that it is wrong to criticize. So there is I sort of meant to touch on this a little bit before, but there's an inherent aspect of criticism by building a competitive project, right? And I definitely don't think that everyone is equal hippie shenanigans, like we should all love each other all the time. But I think that we should be having that interaction by building new stuff and like sharing the joy of open source with each other, as opposed to sniping each other down. And that's part of the problem too. If you, now Wayne no longer works on RVM, and now Michael Papis has stepped up to take it over. But Wayne was very public about the fact that he felt personally attacked, and it bummed him out, and he didn't want to contribute to open source anymore. And now we've sort of lost someone. I don't know what Wayne has been doing lately, and I used to be friends with him. So like we've lost someone as a member of our community because we were jerks. And some of Why the Lucky Stiff's last tweets included lines like, no one ever appreciates the things that you do, and like everything that we build will eventually disappear and go away. If you look at the mailing lists for several of his projects right before he disappeared, several people were saying, why? Seriously, you promised Shoes 3 was going to come out. Is it out yet? What are you doing? It's like one of the most prolific Rubyists ever. People were like demanding that he release stuff more and more quickly and with less and less bugs. Just sort of what happened with Apricot to a certain degree. Now Why the Lucky Stiff is gone, and we cannot bring him back. But I would hope that our actions as a community in general follow Nietzsche's example and Aaron and Y's example, as opposed to the Ruby Drama's example in general, where we all like talk shit about each other, because we're a family. We're all here. Like you all took time out of your day to be apart from your loved ones, to be here listening to me talk to you. And I am forever appreciative of that in general. But we also remember that we're that to each other, right? Like we're going to hang out for a couple days here, and so we're a family. We should treat each other like that, and not like the dysfunctional family that argues, but the good family that loves each other. So that is basically everything that I have to say about that. Yes, cool. So I have 2 more minutes, and so I really generally don't like questions publicly because I think it wastes everyone else in the room's time. But if you have questions for me in 2 minutes, I'd be happy to answer them. And in general, if you have any questions, feel free to catch me at any time over the next 2 days or on the internet at any time in any way, and I will be more than happy to talk about anything with you. But quick, relevant to everyone questions in 2 minutes.
How do we sign up for that list?
So the name, it's a Google group. Sorry, I did not mention that. So if you search Google group Philosophy in a Time of Software, it's a Google group, and you can sign up the normal way you sign up for a Google group. Yes. Anybody else? Awesome. Thank you for signing up for your list. Oh, sorry, one more.
You mentioned a lot of philosophers in there. Can you recommend a book that touches on something like that?
So if you're going to get started, I recommend Russell wrote like A History of Western Philosophy is a good book. It's important to remember that he is also not perfect on many things. So for example, his Nietzsche is really terrible. He basically is like, Nietzsche's a Nazi, LOL, which he wrote the book. So with the historical context, he wrote the book in like 1942, right? And at the time, like his sister was saying like, Nietzsche said Nazism is awesome. So you have to take into account the historical period in which people wrote things. And so I think that Bertrand Russell is overall a fantastic introduction. Just keep in mind that he's not an authoritative source, and when you write a book about every philosopher ever, you're bound to get some of them a little bit wrong. So it's a good introductory material, but like always assume an asterisk on basically everything that you read. So yes, thank you, and in the future, like I said, I'm trying to embrace being happy and creative, like keep things posy in the old school punk hardcore scene, if any of you are from there. So if you see me being a jerk, I would appreciate you telling me that I'm a jerk in a nice way. I do appreciate it because, like I said, I'm trying to improve. So thank you very much.